All right. So what is Romanticism? In a previous video, I talked about Arthur Lovejoy, who thought that there were no that there was no romanticism, singular, but only romanticisms, with an S, plural romanticisms. A variety of things people have labeled romanticism, but if you take them together among themselves, they have nothing necessarily in common. Each particular romanticism, however, probably had some internal coherence, Lovejoy thought. So there's no, as a group, they don't have any coherence, but maybe taken singularly as individual movements within this broader thing that we tend to call romanticism. Maybe individually there was some internal coherence at certain times and places. But today I'm going to talk about one response to, or even a refutation of, Lovejoy's argument. And this is coming from René Wellek. So today we're talking about the theory of romanticism of René Wellek. Wellek's dates, you can see there, 1903, 1995. Wellek was Czech, actually, but he was born in Vienna and then moved to the US, the United States, in 1939. He taught mostly at Yale. Wellek is important for a variety of reasons, but among other things, he was one of the founders of comparative literature. So important for that reason, at least. Wellek was not so interested in ideas as was Lovejoy. He was more interested in literary texts and how best to analyze them or interpret them. When I read Wellek, I really feel like I'm in the presence of a positivist, and like a classic positivist, someone very focused on what he takes to be the facts, who doesn't really have an explicit grand theory which he's trying to push on you, impress on you. Because of these things, though, I tend to find him a little bit boring when I read Wellek. He's not the most exciting guy. There's a lot of historical details, a lot of quotations, references, and stuff. But also because of this, you can learn a lot from reading Wellek. I don't know if he's so popular anymore, but you can learn a lot from a lot of history from reading him. So some relevant works by Wellek on Romanticism. You can also see here the concept of Romanticism in literary history, a history of modern criticism, which was a multi-volume series he wrote on criticism, and then there's a volume on the Romantic Age, a couple of other articles, Romanticism Re-Examined, German and English Romanticism, a confrontation. So these are kind of the most important texts that I'm drawing on here. All right, so Wellek's view of Romanticism. Romanticism he talks about as a kind of revolt against neoclassicism. So Lovejoy, to kind of repeat what I've talked about already, Lovejoy thought there was no unified pan-European movement of Romanticism. Wellek is going to disagree with this. He's going to argue that the major Romantic movements, as he says, form a unity of theories, philosophies, and style, and that these in turn form a coherent group of ideas, each of which implicates the other. So the Romantic movements are unified. They contain a logically related set of ideas. They're based on this kind of logically related set of ideas. Wellek uses the term, or Wellek tells us that Romanticism comes out of a distinction that became important really around the turn of the 19th century. This was a distinction between the classical and the Romantic. So when Wellek is talking about Romantic, or when we talk about Romanticism in cultural history, Wellek thinks it's going back to this distinction that first started to be made kind of the turn of the 19th century, late 18th century, early 19th century, this distinction between classical and Romantic. The distinction between classical and Romantic seems to have been first stated explicitly by August Wilhelm Schlegel, you can see there in the picture, Schlegel is still known as one of the most important early German romantics, along with his brother Friedrich. In arriving at this distinction between classical and romantic, Schlegel was contrasting the poetry of antiquity, so the poetry of Greece and Rome, and modern imitations of this poetry, so the Enlightenment era neoclassicism. He was contrasting those with the Christian and modern poetry that begins in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, so making this distinction between Greek and Roman poetry and modern imitations of Greek and Roman poetry as distinct from the poetry of Christendom, of the modern poetry that started in the Middle Ages and after. So the classic romantic distinction was elaborated a lot by various writers in the first decade of the 19th century, and then it spread to other countries. So it started in Germany, spread to other countries. Wellek says that an important intermediary in this spread was Madame de Stael. You also see on this picture there. De Stael was an influential French intellectual. In fact, she was opposed to Napoleon, who was kind of dominating politics at the time, and she lived mostly in exile. But because of this, because of her living in exile, she traveled around a lot and made a lot of contacts in various European countries. So she knew the Schlegel brothers, and she helped spread their ideas to other parts of Europe. So according to Wellek, it seems that there was a broad recognition among artists, among intellectuals, that something new was happening in the early 19th century, which was opposed to this neoclassicism of the 18th century. So get this classical romantic distinction again. So something distinctively new that was, something distinctively new. In England, so distinctively new compared to these Greek and Roman models, right? This neoclassicism that was based on Greek-Roman models. In England, for example, this new thing was something different than, for example, Alexander Pope. And in Germany, it was something different than the neoclassicist aesthetics of Schiller and Goethe. So Schiller and Goethe had this kind of theory of neoclassicism, although in practice, Wellek actually considers them basically romantic. So Schiller and Goethe are kind of tricky figures. They have got one foot in kind of this neoclassical world and another foot in the kind of this more modern romantic world. Anyway, this reaction against neoclassicism is what Wellek calls the wider sense of romanticism. You might call it the kind of the negative aspect of romanticism, this revolt against neoclassicism. But there's also a special or positive sense of romanticism, which was a special view of poetry that also implied a special view of the world. So you've got this one part of romanticism is its just rejection of neoclassicism. But then what did that rejection entail? Well, we'll come to that. So Romanticism, so what was the actual content of this post-neoclassical, neoclassicist literature? So it implies a kind of, I'm going to talk about this as a kind of metaphysics, aesthetics, and poetics. So Romanticism includes a kind of metaphysics, aesthetics, and poetics, which gives it its actual content. It's not just a rejection of neoclassicism. It's also got these positive views that might be called metaphysical, aesthetic, and poetic. So here is what Wellek says. Sorry, this is kind of a long quote, but it's important. An important quote from one of his chapters, one of his articles. So let's see, what was the actual content of this post-neoclassicist literature? This is what Wellek says in his book, or in his chapter, The Concept of Criticism, or it was an article that became a book chapter. So he says, we find throughout Europe the same conceptions of poetry and of the workings and nature of poetic imagination, the same conception of nature and its relation to man, and basically the same poetic style, with a use of imagery, symbolism, and myth, which is clearly distinct from that of 18th century neoclassicism. The conclusion might be strengthened or modified by attention to other frequently discussed elements, subjectivism, medievalism, folklore, etc. But the following three criteria should be particularly convincing, since each is central for one aspect of the practice of literature: imagination for the view of poetry, nature for the view of the world, and symbol and myth for poetic style. So here he lays out what I've been calling metaphysics, aesthetics, and poetics, right? Nature in its relation to man for metaphysics, the importance of imagination for aesthetics, and then symbol and myth for how you actually create poetry or literature. So Romanticism as a unique metaphysics, a theory of nature, a theory of humanity, reality. It's got a unique aesthetics, a theory of art and literature. What are they? What's important about them? And a unique poetics, a way of making poetry. So let's look in more detail at each of these. All right, so Romantic metaphysics is based on a union of subject and object, of man and nature, consciousness and unconsciousness. This is what Lovejoy, who I've talked about before, mentioned before, refers to as organicism or holism. This union of subject, object, man, nature, consciousness, unconsciousness. The Romantic artist is continuous with nature rather than distinct from nature, is a collaborator with nature in the creation of reality. So the Romantic is therefore at home in nature in a way that's different from the medieval or Enlightenment artist or poet. So for the medievalist and for the Enlightenment era person, intellectual writer, nature was something fallen or low, especially for the medievalist. Nature was something fallen or low, or more for in the Enlightenment, something alien, something over, something other, I should say, something other than the human, something to be overcome, something to exploited for the benefit of mankind. To give a sense of the organic continuity of man and nature, Wellek cites a longish passage from the French writer Gérard de Nerval from a work called Aurelia. I'm going to quote that here. It's worth looking at. So Nerval writes, "How can I have existed so long, I said to myself, outside nature, without identifying myself with her? Everything lives, everything acts, everything corresponds. The magnetic rays emanating from myself or others transverse unimpeded the infinite chain of created things. It is a transparent network which covers the world, and its fine threads communicate from one to another to the planets and the stars. I am now a captive on the earth, but I converse with quiring stars who share my joys and sorrows." So you get this really powerful view of the interconnection of man and nature, of all things. All right. So aesthetics, going on to aesthetics, the Romantic aesthetic or literary theory says that poetry is an act of imagination that reveals nature. And again, we see this union of mind and nature. Poetry expresses the imagination, and the imagination is the poet's participation in the infinite, in the divine. So the imagination is incredibly important. The Romantics wrote a lot about imagination, and this was something they really privileged in their poetry and their poetic theory. They thought that you should find in poetry the workings of the poet's imagination rather than objective description or mirroring of reality. You want to see the poet's imagination, the creativity, the genius. And Wellek quotes Clarence D. Thorpe on this, which is just a useful reinforcement of this idea. So Thorpe wrote, "Such is the power of creative imagination, a seeing, reconciling, combining force that seizes the old, penetrates beneath its surface, disengages the truth slumbering there, and building afresh, bodies forth anew a reconstructed universe in fair forms of artistic power and beauty." And Wellek comments on this. He says, "This could be a summary of the theories of imagination of all the Romantic poets." So, for example, a really important example of this is Wordsworth's long poem, The Prelude. The Prelude is a history of Wordsworth's imagination, which is a really interesting idea and powerful idea. It's significant. So Wordsworth saw this as a kind of what's called the prelude. So it's kind of a prelude or an introduction to what was going to be his greatest work. But he thought he had to begin with this exploration of his own imagination, and where did his imagination come from in the form that he had it. In one of his letters, Wordsworth wrote that in poetry it is the imaginative only, i.e. that which is conversant or turns upon infinity, that powerfully affects me. So it was the imaginative in poetry which had to do with the infinite, which was what was important to him, aesthetically important. And then of course there was Shelley, who in his text The Defense of Poetry, Shelley defined poetry as the expression of the imagination. And we still kind of have this view today. I think this view has continued throughout our culture. When we learn poetry in school, I think we think about it as a kind of self-expression, expression of our own imagination. So this view has stuck around in our own culture. And then Romantic poetics. The Romantic imagination finds or perhaps creates symbols in nature. So when the imagination engages with nature, it finds symbols in there. Symbols are recognized in the moment of poetic inspiration and then are revealed in poetry through symbolic or mythic language. As you see there, a very famous example of Romantic symbolism with William Blake. So writers like William Blake, and visual artists, of course, but writers like William Blake, Percy Bysshe Shelley, who I just mentioned also, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, created new mythologies using special symbols. Of course, these were all English Romantics, but also Victor Hugo in France in his later life created these incredible mythologies drawing on Christian symbols, but also on kind of pre or non-Christian mythologies, all kind of wrapped up together, creating this new kind of myth for kind of the modern world to explain, to redeem the world in kind of new ways. Of course, William Blake is especially famous for his symbolism, which you can see an example of there. All right, so those are the three main things that, the three main aspects of Romanticism that Wellek talks about, which I've kind of divided into metaphysics, aesthetics, and poetics, these more traditional categories. I don't think that Wellek explicitly uses those, but he does, of course, talk about what is aesthetically important, how Romantics created their poetry and how they saw the world. So I've used these traditional categories of metaphysics, aesthetics, and poetics to just easily talk about that. So to conclude, how well does Wellek's theory fit the facts? Wellek himself says that Romanticism is not to be found in every work by every Romantic poet during this period. It was a movement that people might participate in, that sometimes, not at other times. So it's not consistent across a poet's life, for example, or it might not be. Probably for some it is, but maybe not for everyone all of the time. And there are figures that share only some of the traits that Wellek identifies. So Blake is an interesting case, of course. I mean, there's a bunch of kind of these complicated cases in Romantic studies. Blake is one of them. So Blake had a very romantic view of imagination, but his view of nature is somewhat mixed. I think Wellek considers him a romantic in terms of his view of nature, if I remember Wellek. But there's also a case that you can make for him having more of a medieval view of nature, which is different from other romantics like Wordsworth. Then there's Byron. So Byron, everyone pretty much agrees that Byron is a romantic, but he doesn't really generally have a romantic view of the imagination or of nature. And he's, sometimes or debatably mythical or symbolic. So Byron is another interesting, tricky case that may not quite fit into Wellek's theory here. So, and it's hard to know. So it's hard to know what to do with someone like Byron, and he's been a problem for a lot of other scholars as well. So it's also, let's see, it's also interesting that Wellek's features of Romanticism do not quite fit with Lovejoy's, who was the other kind of major romantic scholar of Romanticism at the time, or theorist, I should say, theorist of Romanticism, kind of around Wellek's time, or in the kind of pre-Wellek era. Lovejoy thought that also, of course, thought that there was no unified romantic movement, not also, but he, as I mentioned before, Lovejoy thought there was no unified romantic movement, unlike Wellek. But he did think that there was a set of ideas common among early German romantics. So he didn't think there was a broader unified romantic theory, but he thought if you looked at in particular times, at particular places, you might find certain unities, and he thought he found a certain kind of unified idea in early German Romanticism. So the set of ideas that Lovejoy identified in early German Romanticism were organicism, dynamism, and diversitarianism. And I talked about that in my video on Lovejoy. So in other words, these German Romantics understood the world on the analogy of the organism rather than the machine, so organicism. They understood change to be a basic principle of reality, so dynamism. They really thought change was an important principle of reality. And they thought that there was no single best way to be human, no single truth of existence. So diversity, diversitarianism. So Lovejoy is sticking more at the level of metaphysics here. Right? These are more like metaphysical ideas about reality, about how the Romantics viewed reality. But these ideas do have some, I think, implications for how you interpret poetry or make poetry or other kinds of art. So this metaphysics does have implications for aesthetics and poetics, probably. So anyway, Wellek and Lovejoy would seem to agree on organicism, right? This idea of the union of the human and the nature and the linkages of all things together. But otherwise, their theories don't really seem to overlap. Wellek doesn't really talk about like human diversity in terms of Romanticism. He doesn't really talk about the importance of change, this ever-going change. So, but you could perhaps fit or nest Wellek's view into Lovejoy's view. Wellek writes that recent scholars of Romanticism all see the implication of imagination, symbol, myth, and organic nature, and see it as part of the great endeavor to overcome the split between subject and object, the self and the world, the conscious and the unconscious. You can overcome the subject-object split by seeing reality as an organic whole, right? Like Lovejoy, the organic whole, rather than as a machine of distinct parts. So it seems that the Romantic view of imagination and the Romantic use of symbol and myth maybe serve this organicism. which is more of a metaphysical view. Perhaps they can also serve a belief in what Lovejoy called dynamism and diversitarianism, which is to say, in a belief in the inevitability of change and of human difference. It's somewhat strange that Wellek did not address Lovejoy's criteria directly. Why didn't he? He does address Lovejoy's kind of anti-unified theory of Romanticism. He addresses that part of Lovejoy. He's trying to refute Lovejoy's view that there's no broad, unified romantic movement, but he doesn't really address Lovejoy's criteria in terms of German Romanticism, either to confirm them or refute them, which is interesting. I'm not sure why he doesn't address those specifically, but in any case, I think it's worth comparing these two views if you want to get a better understanding of Romanticism. I don't think either one is kind of the final truth, but they're youthful theories to go through if you're trying to develop your understanding of Romanticism. All right, so with that, let's conclude this little talk about René Wellek's views of Romanticism, and thanks for watching.